Every discard has a price tag attached to it, even the ones that look from the outside like a clean escape. A narcissist walks away, sometimes cruelly, sometimes with barely a word, sometimes with a cold efficiency that makes you question whether any of it was ever real, and for a long time, it looks like they got away with it completely. No consequences, no accountability. Just a fast exit into someone new while you're left standing in the wreckage trying to understand what happened. But there is always a cost. It's simply invisible for longer than you'd expect, buried under new supply and new stories and a performance of thriving that's convincing enough to fool almost everyone watching, including, for a while, the narcissist himself. Today, we're going to walk through exactly what that cost is, why it's unavoidable no matter how skillfully the discard is executed, and why it eventually comes due in full, whether or not you're ever there to witness the payment. Let's start with what a discard actually costs a narcissist in the most literal structural sense, because it's rarely what people assume. It isn't primarily an emotional cost, at least not at first. Narcissists are, for the most part, remarkably skilled at avoiding the immediate emotional reckoning most people would face after ending a long relationship, especially one where they were the one who caused most of the damage. What a discard actually costs is infrastructure. And understanding exactly what infrastructure means in this context is the key to understanding why this price is so much steeper than it appears in the moment it's being paid. Think about what you actually provided over months or years that had nothing to do with romance in the ordinary sense. You learned to read a mood shift 3 moves before it arrived and adjusted the entire room around it before anyone else even noticed something was wrong. You absorbed the friction of arguments before they reached friends or family, translating outbursts into something forgivable. They're just stressed. They didn't mean it that way. So the version of them the world saw stayed clean, likable, sympathetic. You anticipated needs before they were spoken, learned exactly which words de-escalated a fight and which ones made it worse, built, essentially, a highly specialized management system calibrated entirely to this one specific person's psychology. That system took years to build, and when a narcissist discards you, they don't just lose a partner. They lose the entire system instantly, with no transition period and no manual left behind to help anyone else figure out how to rebuild it. This is the first cost, and it's almost always invisible in the immediate aftermath because the initial phase of any discard is usually characterized by a kind of manic relief rather than any visible loss. Freedom, they might call it. A fresh start. And for a while, this feels genuinely true to them because the absence of your specific management hasn't yet had time to reveal what it was actually holding together. This is the same mechanism behind why houses sometimes look structurally fine for weeks after a foundational support has failed. The damage exists, but the visible collapse takes time to catch up to the invisible cause. The second cost, and this one starts revealing itself much faster than the first, is reputational. This is the cost almost nobody accounts for when they imagine what happens after a narcissist discards someone, because it requires understanding something counterintuitive. You were, for the entire duration of the relationship, functioning as an unpaid reputation manager, whether you ever agreed to that role explicitly or not. Every time you made an excuse on their behalf to a friend who witnessed something troubling, every time you smoothed over a public outburst with a plausible explanation, every time you quietly absorbed the consequences of their behavior so the people around them never had to fully register the pattern, all of that was reputational labor, performed constantly, invisibly, and entirely without compensation. When you're gone, that labor stops immediately. And the reputation that was being carefully managed starts, almost right away, to show its actual shape to people who used to only see the curated version. Friends who used to hear, "They're just intense, you'd understand if you knew them better," start witnessing the intensity directly, without your interpretation softening it. Family members who used to give the benefit of the doubt because you always seemed to vouch for them start noticing, especially once a new partner enters the picture, how quickly the same patterns resurface. on a timeline compressed enough that it becomes much harder to write off as bad luck or a series of unrelated incidents. This is the cost that starts becoming visible within months, sometimes even weeks, of a discard. And it's a cost the narcissist genuinely didn't anticipate paying, because for the entire duration of the relationship, you'd been quietly absorbing it on their behalf so effectively that they likely never had to consciously register how much protection you were actually providing. The discard removes the protection instantly. The consequences of that removal take a little longer to fully surface, but they surface with a consistency that's almost impossible to stop once it's begun, because the pattern doesn't need you there to keep repeating itself. It repeats on its own in front of new witnesses, because the underlying behavior was never actually fixed. It was only ever managed. The third cost is the one that takes the longest to arrive, and it's also the deepest, because it strikes at something a narcissist's entire identity depends on far more than reputation or even relationship stability: the ability to generate genuine intimacy at all. This is worth explaining carefully because it's the piece that explains so much of what happens to a narcissist's subsequent relationships after a significant discard, and why so many of them describe a strange, persistent dissatisfaction that seems to follow them regardless of who they're with next. Real intimacy, the kind where someone sees you fully, including your worst moments, and chooses to stay anyway out of genuine will rather than naivety or fear, requires years of accumulated trust to build. It doesn't happen quickly, and it can't be rushed into existing with someone new just because a person has decided, after a discard, to try harder this time. You built that trust with them, slowly, over the entire relationship, through 1,000 small moments of demonstrating that you could see the difficult parts of them and remain anyway, without that patience curdling into resentment or self-abandonment. That specific combination, patience without self-erasure, clarity without cruelty, is exceedingly rare, and it took the narcissist years, whether they ever consciously appreciated it or not, to fully receive it from you. Once discarded, that particular version of trust doesn't transfer. A new partner starting from zero doesn't have the accumulated proof that vulnerability with them won't eventually be punished. Building that kind of safety takes years, and most people understandably don't have the patience or the self-possession required to build it the way you did, especially not with someone who hasn't yet earned the kind of trust that makes that patience feel worthwhile. Which means every relationship that follows a significant discard tends to be shallower than the one that ended, not because the new partners are lesser people, but because the specific conditions that created real depth with you took years to construct and cannot be rushed into existing again on demand. And this compounding is where the real damage actually lives, because none of these three costs, the lost infrastructure, the eroding reputation, the shallowing capacity for intimacy, operate independently of each other. They feed into one another, each one making the next one worse, until what started as a single decision to discard someone becomes a slow, self-reinforcing spiral that most narcissists never fully understand, even while they're living inside its consequences. Here's how the compounding actually works. Without your reputation management running in the background, the pattern becomes visible to new people much faster than it ever became visible to you. This means new relationships end sooner, sometimes within months instead of years, because the new partner recognizes the warning signs on a compressed timeline you never had access to when you were the one learning the pattern in real time, without any prior experience to draw from. Every relationship that ends faster generates a new, smaller reputational hit. A new set of friends who witness the ending, a new person telling their own version of events to their own circle, a slowly accumulating pattern of failed relationships that becomes harder and harder to attribute exclusively to toxic exes the more times it repeats. Meanwhile, the erosion of trust in his own social circle, the friends who start asking harder questions, the family members who stop automatically taking his side, removes exactly the kind of social cover that used to make each individual relationship easier to sustain. When you were the one managing the narrative, he had an entire ecosystem quietly working in his favor, absorbing doubt before it could take root, making excuses before anyone needed to ask hard questions. Without that ecosystem, every new relationship has to survive scrutiny from people who are no longer automatically inclined to give him the benefit of the doubt, which means new partners get less social pressure to stay, less external reassurance that he's really not that bad, and more encouragement, often from people who've watched this happen before, to trust their own doubts rather than dismiss them. This is why so many narcissists, several years after a significant discard, find themselves in a genuinely worse position than they were in during the relationship they walked away from. Not because karma intervened in any mystical sense, but because the structural supports that made the original relationship sustainable simply don't exist anymore, and rebuilding them from scratch, with new people who don't have the same investment you had, turns out to be far harder than anyone anticipated. The relationships get shorter. The reputational damage accumulates faster with each one. And underneath all of it, the original wound, the one that made him need this kind of external validation in the first place, remains completely unaddressed, because nothing about a faster cycle of discard and replacement was ever going to heal something that patience and genuine self-reflection were the only real path toward resolving. Here's the piece that makes this cost particularly heavy, and it's worth naming clearly because it explains a specific kind of suffering that's genuinely hard for a narcissist to access or articulate, even to himself. He cannot properly grieve what he lost, because grieving it honestly would require admitting responsibility for losing it. Most narcissists cannot do this without their entire identity threatening to come apart, because the same defense mechanisms that made the relationship difficult for you in the first place are the ones actively preventing any honest reckoning with its aftermath. So instead of grief, the kind that eventually processes and moves through a person, leaving them changed but functional on the other side, what he experiences is a kind of suspended, unprocessed loss. A mourning with no permission to exist, because acknowledging it fully would mean acknowledging exactly what he threw away and exactly why. This unprocessed grief doesn't just disappear because it isn't allowed to be named. It leaks out sideways, the way suppressed emotion always does. It shows up as a restlessness that follows him into every new relationship, a low-grade dissatisfaction he can't quite trace back to its actual source. It shows up as a compulsive need to prove publicly that he's thriving, the vacation photos posted a little too eagerly, the new relationship announced a little too fast, all of it functioning less as evidence of genuine happiness and more as a performance calibrated to convince an audience, himself included, that the discard cost him nothing at all. It shows up most painfully in the quiet moments no one else witnesses, an ordinary Sunday afternoon with nothing to distract from the fact that something essential is missing, a hollowness that follows him into rooms full of people telling him how wonderful he is, a hollowness that admiration used to fill instantly and now barely touches at all. This is the actual architecture of the cost a narcissist pays for discarding someone who provided the specific, rare combination of infrastructure, reputation management, and genuine intimate trust that you provided. Not a single dramatic consequence, not a clean karmic reckoning delivered on a satisfying timeline, but a slow, compounding erosion that touches nearly every part of his life, in ways he will spend enormous energy avoiding the full acknowledgement of for as long as he possibly can. And here's the truth that makes this cost so uniquely inescapable, the one that separates it from an ordinary consequence he might eventually recover from. He cannot pay it off by trying harder with someone new. That's the instinct that keeps so many narcissists locked in this exact cycle for years, sometimes for the rest of their lives. The belief that the next relationship approached with slightly more effort or slightly more performed self-awareness, will finally restore what the discard actually cost him. It won't, because the cost was never really about effort in the first place. And it was about years of accumulated specific trust that took an entire relationship to build and cannot be manufactured on a faster timeline just because he's decided to want it more this time. This is why so many narcissists, watching from a distance, seem to spiral through relationship after relationship with increasing speed rather than increasing wisdom. Not because they're incapable of learning technically, but because the actual lesson available to them requires a kind of honest self-reflection their entire psychology is built to avoid. Every new relationship becomes another attempt to shortcut a process that was never actually about finding the right person faster. It was about becoming internally someone capable of the patience, humility, and accountability that real intimacy has always required. Work that has nothing to do with who he's dating and everything to do with who he's willing to become. Work he will likely spend years, possibly the rest of his life, circling without ever fully choosing to begin. I want to be honest about something important here, because it matters more than the satisfaction of imagining this cost being paid in full. You were never responsible for making sure this reckoning happened, and you are not required to witness it in order for your own healing to be real. This is the trap so many empaths fall into after being discarded, waiting sometimes for years for proof that the person who hurt them is suffering the consequences they deserve, as though your own peace were somehow contingent on confirming that the cost is actually being paid. It isn't. The cost exists whether or not you ever see a single piece of evidence of it. It compounds in the background of his life, regardless of whether you're checking for signs of it, regardless of whether mutual friends ever mention how different he seems now, regardless of whether the karma you're hoping for ever becomes visible enough to satisfy the part of you that still wants some acknowledgement that what happened to you mattered. Here's what actually matters instead, the thing worth building your peace around rather than his eventual reckoning. You are not paying that cost anymore. You're not the one managing an infrastructure that was never fairly yours to maintain. You're not the one absorbing reputational damage on behalf of someone who never protected yours in return. You're not the one investing years of patience into someone who required that patience without ever earning it through the same accountability he demanded from you. Whatever price he's paying now, in whatever slow, invisible, compounding way it's actually unfolding, you have already stopped being the one who pays it. That shift on its own, regardless of anything happening on his side of the story, is the actual ending that matters. If you're the one who left, or the one who was discarded, and you find yourself still quietly wondering whether any of it caught up with him, whether the discard cost him anything at all, whether your years of love and patience registered as anything more than a convenience he discarded without consequence, I want you to hold both of these truths at once, because they're both genuinely true. Yes, there is almost always a real cost, compounding quietly in the background of his life in ways you may never get direct evidence of. And also, you do not need that evidence in order for your own life right now to be whole, calm, and entirely disconnected from whatever is or isn't unfolding on his side of a story that no longer requires your participation to keep moving forward. The heaviest cost a narcissist pays for discarding someone who genuinely loved him well isn't measured in relationships that end faster or reputations that quietly erode, or an unprocessed grief he'll spend years avoiding, even though all of that is real and all of it accumulates exactly the way we've described. The heaviest cost is simpler than that and far more permanent. He will spend the rest of his life searching for a version of what he had with you in people who don't have the years of patience and depth it took you to build it in the first place, and he will very likely never fully understand why nothing ever quite measures up again. You don't have to watch him pay it to know it's real. You already know exactly what you gave him because you're the one who carried the weight of it for years, without ever once being properly thanked for the cost of it yourself. Thanks for watching.